thank you so much for joining us. And so many attendees are trickling in. We'll go ahead and get started because we are on a tight schedule with a lot to get to. So by way of a quick introduction, you've all seen our faces if you've seen our posters plastered up around campus, but this is Tom, Chris, and I, and we are so excited to be talking to you about the earliest stages of research, how to move from topic to question, how to find topics and questions that are compelling to you and compelling to the world. We will paste our bios in the chat and go ahead and get started. So, Tom, if you'd like to start us off with the first question. Quite a few of students and teachers on this call were interested in, how to get started, right? But just as many of them were interested in the importance of research to begin with. So from teachers and students, why do you think it's important for high school students to learn and practice research skills in the first place?
Thank you, Frank. And I know all of you know what a gem of a colleague you have in Frank, but I just want to echo that about how wonderful it is. And thank you for making this happen. So I think there are probably two things I would start out with. It's a big question, but I think there are two things that for me are core to the question of why get involved in research as soon as humanly possible. The first of them, I think, comes out of something that I only became aware of maybe 10 years into my career of teaching, which is that at the end of a class, students would come to me, end of the class where there was no research component whatsoever, where basically I was teaching a history course and there was no element really of production of original research. And a student would come to me and say, I love this class. Or I would hear people grumbling that they didn't like this class, that they hated history, that they loved history. And of course, I love the fact that some students loved it. But at the end of the day, for both of these camps, I couldn't help but think to myself, I'm glad that you love this course, but this course, technically speaking, does not resemble in any way, shape, or form what I as an historian really do, or what any professional researcher in this field actually does. So whatever it is that you love is actually at a great distance from what we actually do. And if you hated this course, I'm really sad that you hated it, but I don't know exactly what you hate, because I didn't actually get a chance to work with you on what I know I do and what I love about history on a daily basis. And so since that realization, I know for myself, I have tried to make basically every course I teach, even lecture courses, research seminars, because I want my students not to become copies of me, like major in history or something of that nature, but I want them to really know what it is that I do and what my colleagues do and what it looks like to dance and wrestle with ambiguity. Because at the end of the day, if they love that, then in my view, they truly understand what history is, and what they love is really what they think they love. And if they decide that it's not for them, more power to them, but at least they know that the thing that they say they don't love is truly history. But this applies to anthropology or literature or chemical engineering or programming. That research, it's, to study something without doing research in it is a bit like learning, football by watching game footage for your whole life and never getting on the field. The second one, and then I want to make sure that we kind of get through lots of questions here. The second one is that in my way of thinking, the number one mindset that I think is so valuable to be instilled in the course of any formal education, really from high school onward, is a comfort with ambiguity, with uncertainty. And so when I want my students from the earliest possible stage, I don't teach in high school, but if I did, this would be on my mind, but is I want a student to leave my course with a mindset that if you were to throw me into the ocean of ambiguity, where none of the questions are like laid out for me, and there's no one there to point and tell me what is what, I want their mindset to be such a way that they are willing to stay in that discomfort and learn the methods of turning all of that uncertainty and discomfort and ambiguity into questions that they then have the ability and skill set to know how to answer. Because I feel like in our day and age, there's so much uncertainty, there's so much ambiguity, but there are two mindsets that are more and more dominant. One is a kind of absolutism, or even a sort of totalitarian mindset, which is my answer to ambiguity is to get rid of ambiguity, to flatten it out. And then another response to ambiguity we often see is escapism, is that I just don't want to feel the discomfort. And I feel like research is a way, teaching research is a way to develop a mindset that is essential in so many walks of life. Of, you throw me in the aquarium of uncertainty, into the ocean of uncertainty, I know how to stay with this discomfort and turn uncertainty into questions, and then maybe how to turn questions into answers. And our students in undergrad just simply often arrive and they don't necessarily know how to do that. And I feel like research is really the way we learn how to turn uncertainty into questions, and then questions into answers. That'd be my first sort of initial stab at that wonderful question.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, think of how many things in your education and life are going to supposedly make you more independent. I feel like research is something that can really help you a lot in this regard, partly for some of the reasons that Tom was mentioning of, if you're in a preset curriculum, it's easy to feel like, you're just kind of passively accepting what some authority is sharing with you. And you can certainly gain a lot from them, but when you're trying to do a research project, you may have goals that you bring to it, but you don't know what the outcome is going to be in advance. So you do indeed have to become very comfortable with that uncertainty. You have to avoid the false step of trying to say from the get-go, my research means this. At an early stage, you often don't know what your research means. You may have an interest or some kind of something that's nagging at you or that's motivating you, you can't quite articulate. And it takes a while. Sometimes it's not until you really finish the project that you understand what it's about. But if you do make that discovery, it can be tremendously empowering. And that if you are only sticking with the set curriculum and like the courses that you take in high school, you may be taking in college, you may feel like, who am I to attempt to break new ground in this field or discipline? But really, once you start doing research, you can discover a lot of those possibilities. And I think that is when you realize how much is actually open to you, not just that there are so-called gaps in the literature or gaps in the field, or, the gaps in all fields are essentially endless and, innumerable. But you will discover within any particular topic or field, again, from chemistry to literature, that there's so many possibilities and that you can actually articulate it in relation to something that's really of interest to you. So that there's a kind of questioning the outside world, but also a kind of self-questioning process that comes into that. And that is something that you will bring to many different stages of life.
Thank you, Tom and Chris, for your initial thoughts. Now we'll move into a sort of phased approach to the talk. So we'll have some questions on coming up with initial ideas, some others on accessibility, topics that are as important as ever, and round out with some questions on organization and, when is enough enough? So second question, and maybe Chris, if you want to take it first this time, how do you help students who don't have an initial idea come up with one? Which comes first, the interest or the sources and methods?
Well, I think that there are a lot of ideas about how research begins that we all grapple with every single project. And this is one where, if you're one of those fortunate people who does have a really keen interest and you feel like it's tied to your personhood or who you are, that's great. Then it can be relatively easy to work with a sounding board or an advisor or a peer to kind of suss out exactly where your interests lie. And I can definitely identify with this question because I run into it all the time with myself, with my students, about how do you try to generate interest seemingly from nothing, right? If let's say that someone just took this course because it fit in their schedule, but they don't feel like an initial an intrinsic tie to the particular topic. How do you get that person, or when it's you, to make it their own? Because I feel like this is a scenario that we encounter in high school, in college, and graduate school if you do that, or in jobs, where you end up in a lot of situations where you have to make the best of it, and you do have to figure out how to make it your own. And so sometimes this can come from dealing with sources and techniques for dealing with sources. So if you are dealing with a particular topic and you know like keywords associated with that topic, and you plug them into Google, right? You just look at the Google search results or a library search results, and then you try to notice, like, what is the world kind of throwing back at you? Or what is this database or the internet throwing back at you? Is it, which of these results in a flicker of interest for me? And sometimes that will be the beginning of this thread of interest in how this topic or this field is related to you and your interests. And you start tugging on that, and you end up generating new keywords and new leads for research projects. So when the interest comes first, I feel like then it's more of an issue of trying to get from topic to a series of questions. And one problem or one mistake that we see a lot of novice researchers making is they try to jump to the one question right at the beginning, and that this can actually close out so many possibilities. Often what can be a much better approach is if you start with your basic hypothesis or hunch of what you're interested in, you find a source, and then you try to generate as many questions and like genres of questions as you can about that one thing. And it's almost like you're forcing yourself into a creativity exercise of trying to think your way around this one object or this one, literary source, whatever it might be, to see, like, is there any kind of pattern that emerges if I were to first generate these questions and then step outside myself and look back with outside eyes? Like, if I had to hypothesize, what are this person's interests? Where do they truly lie? Then you may be much closer to the problem that really determines your engagement with this broad topic, where there can be just innumerable possibilities. But if you can identify what that particular problem is, then you have kind of an axe to cut through all of the different sources that are out there. And instead of thinking of like trying to narrow down a broad topic into a narrow one, you can start to identify the various case studies that you could potentially look at to explore this much, much bigger problem. So this is, I think, one key element of that. Tom, what would you add?
Yeah, I mean, this is really important, and it's kind of it's like there's like a case to make this really concrete. Like if there's a conversation where a student might come to office hours and and say, I don't really know what it is I work on, and then just in a conversation, it's like, well, tell me your initial sense of what might be possibly on your mind. And I remember I was teaching a course on the history of information technology, and a student said, well, my background is this. I'm interested in Basque culture because I actually have some background in that, and I don't know. And I said, well, let's stop right there. Just let's pause right there. Let's plug in the keyword Basque into an archived repository collection, and let's just see what comes up. Like, let's not overthink meaning and guidance and purpose at this point. Let's just see what happens as we plug it in, and we receive a sort of set of, it's not Google, but a set of finding aid, archival finding aid results. And then the basic thing, and this is the key of it, is at that point when there are so many loud voices in a student's head competing for dominance, shouting over each other, the real skill that we have to learn in the very beginning process of research is discerning which of these voices is kind of one's instinct versus which ones are, basically things we pick up along the way, our mom and dad, our authority figures, and just learning how to discern that and like actually trust it. And so, we got maybe a set of results and we're scrolling through. I said, listen, all you need to do here is imagine that you are hooked up to an EKG machine, and imagine that the needle on this thing is registering like the activity in your system. If you see something that jumps out at you, maybe the needle jumps, otherwise, like, it kind of stays even. And all we want to do is pay attention to when the needle jumps. You don't need to know why it jumps. You just need to be honest that something happened. And we're scrolling through, and suddenly we hit this thing about like a California-based bakery, a Basque-owned bakery. And she said, well, this is obviously not about the course, but I'm going to follow this instruction and tell you that, yeah, my needle jumped, like something was there. It's like, okay, let's look inside. And it turned out that this bakery, a little bit like the Oakland, Black-owned Oakland bakery connected to the Black Panther movement, that as it turned out, this Basque bakery was also doubling as kind of a community center, a matchmaking community, like helping people find jobs. It actually was an information hub for this community. And so suddenly it's like, well, this actually might be relevant for our class about information technology and how communication happens. And it's something that can tie in to something that actually jumped on the needle. And the only thing I kind of tried to hold up a mirror to what just happened in the conversation. I said, listen, the only thing I did as the professor in this conversation was I asked you to listen to yourself and to be honest when the needle jumped, and to not like skip it or avoid that. That's all I did. Everything else you did. Just in the simple act of trusting that instinct and clicking on that link and reading about this collection, it turned in, fast forward, it turned into an award-winning honors thesis that came out of this moment of self-trust. And for me, that's the place, especially when Chris was talking about in this really important category where either a student doesn't have a clear interest or has lots of competing interests. The key is not necessarily to narrow down the topic. That's actually a dead end. It's to start to refine a sense of being able to tap in, listen to oneself, and trust those instincts, such that if something flickers on the page, something resonates, trust yourself enough to click on that link, to open that document, to look at it and see what's there. And from that little like fragment, that little tiny shard of glass, then that can go on and on into a series of questions, like Chris was saying, and can take the shape of a project. That's where this, so many brilliant works come from. The Great Cat Massacre, these classics, The Cheese and the Worms, Carlo Ginzburg, these came from these little moments of self-trust that we learn in the research process, and that where instinct comes from.
Thank you, Chris and Tom. Both of your responses, interestingly, sort of framed it as an intensely self-driven, self-centered endeavor. There are also some teachers and archivists and librarians on this call who were wondering, how collaborative research could operate. So are there any whole classroom structures or activities that can help students find, engage in, vet, and collaboratively evaluate potential research topics and questions? Is there a collaborative element to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that we both have a bunch of ideas about this, but I'm curious for if anybody has had the same situation where like everybody's brainstorming and throwing out ideas, but people start to maybe unconsciously start to inhibit their peers, or as a teacher, you start to realize you're actually inhibiting your students' kind of free flow of ideas and true expressions of interest. Some of what Tom was talking about just now of, hold on, let's pause here and like, let's hear more about that. Like, tell me more about that thing. I feel like when you're in a classroom environment and you do want to have multiple people working together, one of the key elements is to try to make whatever group activity it is be as non-judgmental as possible. So for example, one of the things that can often kill creativity off at an early stage in the research process is people trying to disabuse each other of their assumptions. Like, what do you know about Chinese culture? Or what do you know about, astrophysics? Like you're not qualified to wonder those things about that topic. And then the person's like, okay, I guess not. I shouldn't be asking these questions. Even really naive questions, even politically incorrect questions, even questions that are not right for some reason, can still be a really, really important clue in the brainstorming process for what somebody is interested in. And so to the extent that you can create whole classroom activities where people are, for example, everybody brings to class a research question or a set of 5 research questions, and then they work with a peer to say, well, what if we all, each of us, first for ourselves, and then with each other tries to swap out one of the variables in a research question, how does that change that EKG reading that Tom was talking about? Like, do I feel more interested in my research question or less? If I am, working on a project related to child abuse, but we change it to elder abuse, am I more, less, or just as interested in that research question? And again, if someone's like, well, you should be equally interested in those two things because they're both important with a capital I, but you feel like one is more important to you than the other, that's where you want to keep that group brainstorming non-judgmental. Your interlocutor, your sounding board is just like, okay, that's fine. Okay, so that's clearly more important for your question. Let's try changing a different variable and see what happens. So this is the one type of thing that you can do in the classroom.
Yeah, it's fundamentally collaborative, because the irony of the early research process is that the researcher really doesn't know what they're doing. They don't actually, the only thing the researcher fundamentally knows better than everyone else around them is that they're being honest when they say that something concerns them. And I'm not, I don't mean that researchers in high school or researchers in college. I mean people on their fifth book. There is something about something that bothers them in a deep, enduring way. That's the only thing that they are completely certain of in that opening phase of the process. Of course, they can talk the talk, they could write fellowship applications, they can pretend as if they know what the intellectual meaning of it is. But the truth of it is they kind of just have the certainty of the feeling of it. And so there's this fundamentally collaborative dimension of that phase of the research process where sounding boards and colleagues are essential. And just, so for example, I sat with a student who came in and was really interested in, this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, came in and said, I want to do a project on online activism involving Black Lives Matter activists and how online activism connects to offline activism. And this was also in that history of information course. So it's like, okay, well, first of all, this is awesome. I'm glad that you have a clear sense of what concerns you. The challenge here, of course, is that we don't have the archives of, the BLM archives. There is no such thing yet. And it's a 10-week course, so we don't have time to do ethnographies and interviews to do justice to this. And so I was the sounding board to try to figure out, is there a way for us to get from where you are, student who is being honest with me about that this concerns me, is there a way for me to re-articulate a different shape of a project, a different kind of question, in such a way that you as the student or as just a colleague still feel the same sense of concern? And long story short, we got to this place where we said, does it have to be the 21st century? And they said, no, it doesn't have to be the 21st century, technically speaking. It does have to be about racial justice. So like, that's non-negotiable, but time is, is not necessarily negotiable. And I said, well, does it have to be online? Does it have to be digital? Is there something essential to that? No, but it does have to be something kind of telecommunication, something that is different than marching in the streets. I want a division of like, that matters to me. Okay, well, what about the telephone tree? Like so-and-so calls, person A calls B, calls C, calls D, used back in the day. I remember that from, I don't know, if there was a rained out baseball practice and how are you going to tell the whole team not to show up at the field? You would do these telephone trees and used in different organizations. Would you be equally interested in looking in the papers, the Martin Luther King papers, or the papers of SNCC or of an organization, to figure out how they use telecommunications to mobilize the activists for like a just-in-time demonstration, to show up at a outside a jail to protest the imprisonment at that moment of someone? And the student's face was like, yeah, like this. And what we arrived at, and what is extremely hard to arrive at by yourself, is we had gotten on the surface of it, this was a completely different project. It was about a different time period, a different group of people, a different technology, but we were able to get to a place where the problem was still there. But now the difference is we do have access to these archives. We can actually dive into this in the here and now. And it still has resonance and it still has relevance to your concern with Black Lives Matter. The introduction of your paper could mention Black Lives Matter and online activism, but then the core of the research might be about telephone trees and 1960 civil rights organization. So there's something, so this is a collaborative venture. I'm not a co-author in that student's paper. It's not collaboration in that sense, but it's collaboration where another human being, another sort of fellow traveler can help you figure out how to go from one case to another case and not lose what brought you there in the first place. So many students lose home in the course of just choosing a project, choosing a topic, because there's deadline or because they don't know how to find home again. So that's the fundamentally collaborative part of that students can help each other with too.
Thank you. I guess one thing too is that it's a privilege to be able to find home in the first place, to have the opportunity to access research, research resources, and be able to find the sort of primary source material that you really want to sink your teeth into. So our next question is about accessibility. It comes from students and teachers. Is there a way for students in less privileged areas to indicate and initiate research projects without existing frameworks or support? And what about research projects whose central project relies on maybe a body of material that isn't entirely accessible? So we have two types of accessibility here: accessibility in terms of student resources and supports, and accessibility in terms of archival materials.
If I could just take a first pass at this, because I think this is a really critical one. There's something, I do a lot of work in archives, so I have to use that as a metaphor, although I know it's not universally relevant, but collections of unpublished material, collections of resources, there is a surprisingly strange distribution of these kinds of materials on planet Earth. That are different than, say, libraries. In the case of libraries, it really is that the wealth of an institution equals the quantity and maybe quality of the collection of a library. Just have, buying power means, and more space means more books. Harvard has more books than some other institution without the same financial firepower. These institutions do undoubtedly have larger archival collections and subscription databases and so forth, but it doesn't always necessarily mean that a lesser funded or lesser financed, out of the way institution will have nothing. And quite the contrary, the way that many of these collections, there are thousands of special collections just in North America. Every main library of every public library has one, every historical society, there are corporate archives, et cetera, et cetera. And what's funny about these collections is, let's say someone is a graduate of a suburban kind of rural Kansas City institution from the 30s. They went to a school that maybe no one here has heard of or has collections, connections to, but they graduated from this place. And then they went on and had a very strange and interesting career. And they, for example, were on the long march with Mao Zedong, something that very few people got the chance to do. Well, when it comes time for that person or their family after the death of that person to figure out where to donate those materials, oftentimes there is this intimate decision that is made to donate materials to an institution that had some personal connection in some way with the person themselves. So as it stands, there is a much underserviced kind of lower ranked, let's say in US News and World Report, institution in Kansas that houses papers that are actually incredibly insightful and brilliant for someone who might be interested in studying 20th century China. So Kansas City is a great place, it turns out, to do original research on 20th century China. And that story actually is not exceptional. There are these strange, kind of mother loads of materials scattered in many parts in unexpected places in the world that don't map directly onto wealth in the same way that, for example, library holdings do. And that's exciting. And then there are also ways, I won't dive into this, but there are also ways, of course, to use even materials that you can't physically get your hands on in the research process of figuring out what it is that you want to do. Finding aids, these things that I mentioned that give you the contents and inventories of archival collections, even if you physically can't get on a plane and go to the archive and read the materials, these documents produced by loving archivists and librarians are incredibly insightful and full of all sorts of leads and insights that even if you're not able to get into the collections themselves, might inspire insight into what you are actually interested in doing. The story of the Basque bakery as an information hub, even if that student had not been able to read those papers, it might have triggered something in for her that then would have led her in a different direction towards different materials, but with a sense of what it is that she actually wants to do, which is really the hard part in the beginning stages. So just two things that are unexpected, I think, about accessibility when it comes to research. I don't know, Chris, if you wanted to dive in.
Sure. Yeah. And accessibility, I think, is a big imperative, especially these days. And the good news is that a lot of rich institutions, the Harvards of the world, and also the UBCs are digitizing a lot of materials. And so, last week, earlier this week, I had a PhD from New Zealand email me asking about some former UBC faculty member. And sometimes you'll be surprised how much is actually online. So you go to the library catalog, you type in the person's name or what you think their name is, and sure enough, a photo pops up from the UBC Special Collections and Archives and a list of a few of their works. And so you don't actually have to be a member of that institution sometimes to access the material. And even again, people who already have a PhD don't realize how much the field has changed. So if you're working with people for whom accessibility to research sources seems to be a big obstacle, I'd say number one thing is just realize and explore a bit how much is available for free. There's the World Catalog, worldcat.org. You can find a wide variety of materials. You may be surprised at how many, physical and digital libraries are within your grasp or in your locality or out there on the web. So I think that would be one key thing. I think there are also opportunities to help empower researchers for whom access is a problem through social media. One of the experiments that Tom and I have been doing on TikTok is it's a level playing field in some way, or like TikTok and other social media platforms can be quite good for kind of cutting across the field. So not just staying in the silo of your one institution, but making connections with people at a whole variety of places. So that would be another that I would suggest for networking. And then I think the last part that I'd mention just very quickly, building on what Tom was talking about with Plan Bs, is if you can help, or if you are a scholar, we all are scholars who have accessibility concerns. We have constrained time. We can't travel to our archives in China nowadays. We can't travel anywhere during COVID times. And so if you have that mindset of hold on to your problem, but change to a different case in a way that can be satisfying for you, that is when you can realize that for now, for this term paper or whatever it is, I'm going to do this much, but I'm also going to hold on to my problem so that when I do have more resources or activities, I could do it at I can do the next phase of the project, or I can do it at a larger scale.
Thank you. And, just to say, Tom and Chris are doing wonderful work on the accessibility front. How many professors do you know are doing work on TikTok? Like, I feel like that should be just an honest question we should think about. But, I guess an equally important question is to look back at ourselves. Like, this panel isn't a representative body of what academia should look like, what it does look like. And so, inevitably we bring to the table some biases and blind spots that a lot of us might miss, but some of us might be able to spot. So given that it's inevitable, that subjectivity is inevitable in research, how should we deal with it responsibly?
I guess I can start by suggesting, and a lot of what our book is grappling with is this sense that I think it's something for researchers at all phases of like, what do I do now? What do I do next? What is the right project for me? And I can tell you that problem, if you feel insecure in high school at all, it doesn't fade. You can build more self-assurance and experience, but still you are constantly dealing with the expectations of a field, the expectations of a discipline, which may have its own priorities and its own expectations of what you should be working on. And so, there are, again, a lot of external voices, and you really do need to be in tune with your internal voice to decide between these multiple options that may be open for you. And again, this is a question that I think is not just tied to the question of accessibility or whatever resources are available to you as a researcher. It's a very personal and internal one. And so just to give like one example, I wrote a book about the history of laughter in China in the early 20th century. Well, that it was well received, and I could just keep hoeing that row and write the next chapter of like what happened in the next historical period. And I'm interested in doing that eventually. But after doing that stage of the project, I felt like I wanted to do something else. And so to do the non-predictable thing of just keep hoeing that one row. And so I think that this is something that you will come into contact with, in figuring out your own subjectivity as a researcher, because it's something that we all do. Of people will form expectations about you based on the way that you look, or the choices that you make, or the work that you have done in the past. And I think it takes a lot of self-confidence and self-awareness in particular to know when is the right time to kind of forge ahead on your current project, and when is it time to change to a different project, because now your problem is kind of shifted in a new direction, maybe based on external factors, maybe based on something you discovered in that initial project, and now you're wanting to change to something else. So I think that would be my initial answer to that question of how to deal with subjectivity, because it's not, I wouldn't think of research in deterministic terms. Like, again, to use my own example, you don't have to be Chinese to study things Chinese. You can discover a whole number of problems in the field of Chinese literary history that are very near and dear to you, whatever your origins may be. And I think this is another way that in many fields, deterministic notions of if you are X, then you research X fall apart. All right, astrophysics, how do you explain your engagement with that? You often have to do it in terms not just of identity, but also some kind of intellectual problem that really engages you.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I would say that research it's fundamentally a question of subjectivity, and not in the sense of that any research project that you are undertaking of your own kind of free will, that is not commissioned to you or assigned to you as a research assistant, or something of this nature. But any research project that you are choosing to undertake is in some way, shape, or form, and especially if you're excited about it, I mean, is in some way, shape, or form connected to the stuff that makes you you, and how it just happens to bump up against or abrade or resonate with something that is happening in whatever it is that you're encountering. And it's very it takes time to even know what that connection is. I think Chris said this, and this is true. Like, I didn't realize what my dissertation and my first book was about until probably about, I don't know, 2 weeks before submitting it to my committee. And I'd spent many years on it. My second book, I spent probably 5 years working full-time actively on it until it came to light, really, what was the connection with something inside. I had a conversation with a student, and it was an assignment. She came into the class. This is a different course, History of Modern China. And she said, I think I want to, for the final paper, I think I want to write something about geomancy, about feng shui. And I said, that sounds great. Okay, so can you tell me why you think you've arrived at that? You could do Chinese economic history, you could do cultural and literary, you could do anything. So what is it do you think that draws you here? And the initial interaction, and I suspect this might be true of at least some of some of us in the audience who are really high achieving and probably, are impressive to many teachers and instructors, and that gets to you. It's hard to be impressive, because then the desire is to continue impressing. And this student was high achieving and really it was very clear to kind of impress me, almost like she was reapplying to the school where she was already a student. And so it was all this sort of academic jargon of there's a gap in the literature, I want to make an intervention, this, that, and the other thing. And all of it is just words. And then we kind of stayed with it saying, okay, fine, but kind of really why do you think you're here? Why do you think you're connected? Long story short, at one point in the conversation, her whole kind of energy just changed. And it went from this performance of intelligence, this like act of look that I'm trying to prove to you my capacities, to just a sort of vulnerability, which went something like this. My mom is by far the most rational person I've ever met. She's like on top of everything. She's just really sort of schematic, logical thinker. She's a lawyer and she believes in feng shui. And I can't wrap my head around that. I mean, so, that might be like my astrophysics dad is also like reads the astrology page and like seriously believes in this stuff. And I can't reconcile how this sort of rationality and what I consider to be irrational or sort of cosmic and spiritual. And so that's it. That's why. So in some sense, the student is actually writing about their life, but mom is never going to show up in that final paper. It's never going to be anywhere in the footnotes. There's not going to be anywhere. None of those dinner time conversations are there, but they are. And that's the reason, at least for this course, why political economy or environmental history doesn't cut the mustard, because it's not where the problem is. It's not the thing that is actually the sort of irritant. And so we often think, and this ties back to what Chris was saying with the idea of disabusing our students, like eradicating their assumptions, smashing them, like we really feel like we can stand and deliver Dead Poet Society, our students sometimes. And that sets up subjectivity as if it's the enemy of research, as if it's the thing that needs to be sort of kind of conquered in order to get to objectivity, when in fact, subjectivity is the whole reason you're here. You feel any of those resonant frequencies in the first place. It's the reason the EKG needle is moving. And so doing research without any subjectivity, without any assumptions, is like, I think the way we talk about it is like sailing on a windless day. You're just going to sit there dead in the water. You have to know how to channel the wind and not let the wind steer you into stereotype and bigotry and cliche and whatnot. But you do want the wind. You do want the subjectivity. And that's what the student was doing. She was trying to overcome subjectivity by using all of these other excuses for why I care about this. And it's like, it's okay that this is about mom. It's okay. Let's now move forward. Because every great researcher I know I have ever met, if you really just sit with them, it won't take long before they say, this comes from like a conversation with my best friend. This comes from something that like happened to me when I was 14. This came from this came from that. And there's an awareness. And as a researcher, the more you're aware of what your subjectivity is doing and what therefore, like why you keep seeing the same problems everywhere you look, it's almost like a superpower, because like Chris was saying, it frees you from being bound to any one case. If this case turns out to require $10,000 of airline fees and I just can't do it, that doesn't mean that I have to stop research if I can find my home and those resonant frequencies in what on the surface might look like a completely different project. That's a superpower.
So we have a couple of attendee questions in the chat that maybe we can sort of put forth a sort of combination of. Tom, you mentioned in your response that oftentimes research grows from a good conversation with colleagues or mentors, and there are quite a few of us students and faculty wondering how we connect with faculty and mentors in the first place, and specifically, what is the role of social media in helping us share scholarship, ask questions, generate discussions, network? How have you two found that tool, and how have you two sort of found connection most fruitful?
Yeah, just real quick, and then I think there are two different ways of generating these kinds of things. One with social media, and really any genre of expression that is not the peer-reviewed article, or book chapter. I often ask my students to think about what research questions would they need to answer about whatever their topic is if they were going to produce not a paper, but a graphic novel or an installation piece or a film or a treatment for a pilot for a TV show. And the answer is that the genres in question demand very different things. If I'm writing a chapter of a book, I don't have to ask myself hardly ever, what did this person smell like? What was their body language? How do they interact? Like, what was the tone of their voice? Um, all of these things that make up our humanity, the genre of the nonfiction paper, the final paper, actually lets us off the hook to even think about. But if I have to make a graphic novel, I got to ask, like, what was this wardrobe? Like, what was body language? What was posture? And then I have to make the leap of what primary source might exist on planet Earth that would allow me to figure out what their wardrobe looked like. And then suddenly, I might not find the answer to that question, but in the process of going to look for it, I might find stuff that I would never have found if I had been satisfied with the genre in which I was. So to me, the whole social media thing is great for scholarly outreach, just outreach and connection, but it's also a wonderful way to like take two different genres and just smash them together in like a particle collider and generate questions and curiosities that probably wouldn't have occurred to the researcher in a million years if you just said, write a final paper. I'll stop there and you may pause there, and maybe Chris, you can dive in.
Yeah, and I think that Tom and I have both spent a lot of time on YouTube doing very different things. But I think one of the things that we both do on social media, I think both on YouTube and TikTok, is drafting, actually. Drafting ideas, and if you feel kind of comfortable with it, or you can do it in a semi-private version, or if you really feel comfortable in a public version, this is one way to generate ideas, throw them out there, sometimes get interesting, unexpected feedback. But I have drafted entire books that I did as kind of YouTube video lectures or video essays, and then rewrote into book chapters. And so this can be interesting. I think that one way that social media can be very good is it forces economy, right? Because the internet is notorious for having a really short attention span. So you better be really articulate. Sometimes you can be really raw and unpolished as well. And the internet loves that as well. But you can have fragmentary ideas and put them out there. And again, sometimes throw out a rock and get back jade, as the saying goes. So I think that it can be a humongous time suck in some ways. And so you might want to think, what are your end games, or what are your goals for this course, and having everybody be a part of a forum or community. Or if you have particular research goals, how is this going to help you connect with people? So that's a humongous topic, and I think could be the issue of a whole session. But I wanted to kind of seg from that a little bit to the question, reaching out to find mentors or professors, because I know this can feel like a real challenge. And it's something that we all have to do when we're going to college, or the next phase. You want to have a rapport with people. You want to get their help on the things that you care about. And I will say that, having had many meetings with students, I find it much easier to talk to students when they come to me and say, not, I'm interested in social justice, because that always begs the question, well, not just why you're interested in social justice, like we all are, but like, what was it that made you interested? Or, I would have an easier time in responding if someone came to me and said, I read this particular newspaper article, or I talked to this person, or I had this particular experience, kind of like the feng shui example that Tom was giving, that helps me very quickly hone into their experience and their particular articulation or engagement with this humongous topic. So I think that would be one really quick way of making a connection with someone and finding a mentor or professor who could then provide more detailed, useful responses to you. The last thing that I would add just very quickly is when you aren't always going to people asking for them to solve your problem, even if they're subject matter experts, like they may be working on their own projects, they're not going to do your research for you, but they can give tips, they can give kind of non-judgmental advice or leads that can be really, really productive. So definitely do talk to people. Do go to office hours. Wouldn't you agree, Tom? This is like his first viral TikTok videos about go to office
no, I
hours.
mean, it's amazing how many people are afraid of going to office hours or feel like office hours is yet another place where you have to perform intelligence or reapply to the school you already got into, and none of those things are true. Your instructors, your profs, they want to meet you, and office hours with no one there is lonely and it's just pointless. And you're like, what a missed opportunity. We could be conversing about anything. And I think that's key. I wanted to dive in. There's a question here from Dacian about, is there any difference in STEM and non-STEM research in high school? And I think this is actually a really important point. My sense, just by meeting the people who come in like the doorway on day one, and I remember this at Columbia too, is that there is a gap, I would say, where STEM education actually introduces the kinds of research that Chris and I are talking about at a far earlier and more systematic stage than non-STEM. I actually think that, let me give you one very concrete example. If you take an introduction to CS class and you walk in, the final assignment is not going to be program the equivalent of Microsoft Word. Like, your final assignment is 1,000,000 lines of code application. It's like program Pong. It's going to be program like, Pac-Man or something real, like an applet, something basic. And the students in that will actually understand that's because CS is an immense field and that you can only do so much in the span of time, span of space. And so they understand it because they've had the training or exposure in many cases to like what it looks like to produce knowledge in one or another STEM field. They've actually seen the kinds of things that I know that I was talking about earlier in the workshop about. I want you to understand what it really looks like to produce knowledge within an historical framework. By comparison, what do I do in many of my classes, or what have I historically done? I assign a paper where in 10 weeks where a student has to come up with an argument. That is the humanistic equivalent of asking a CS student to write 100,000 lines of code application. It can't be done. You cannot in 10 weeks identify a topic, turn it into a question, find the sources you need to answer that question, go through the drafting and revision process, figure out what it is, build the thing, and then turn it in. So we actually sort of, I'm seeking universities here. I think we almost disrespect humanistic field and social sciences field by giving a misperception to students that you can, build an argument in such a short time. We give our PhD students 24 weeks to write an argumentative research-based paper. I give my undergrads, or have, like 10 weeks. And so what ends up happening is the final paper turns out to be a glorified book report, for lack of a better term. And what ends up happening, as the instructor, it feels less than satisfying. For the student, it feels less than satisfying because they might get an A on it, but they think, I guess history is a joke because I kind of just did that last night, or I did it over the course of a week. I got an A. So I guess that's historical knowledge. So there's this vast, weird disservice going on. And I don't know, I don't know why it is that sort of hands-onness seems to be really advanced in the STEM field. And then at least if I judge it based on a lot of the, National History Day requests I get through email, there's a sort of mismatch. And that's another big, excitement, at least for me and I know in Chris in history and humanities, is there is nothing about high schoolers in particular that in any way disqualifies them from doing, I don't just mean good research in a patronizing, isn't that cute sort of way. I mean, do research that if you were my master's student or my PhD advisee, that I would be overjoyed at the sophistication and brilliance of the question that you just generated. Yes, maybe you need more training to be able to fully answer the question, but you have generated and constructed an absolutely beautiful, brilliant question. That's, I think, the idea of getting an early start on research is starting to build questions. Questions are really hard to build. It's not just a natural instinct to be, to know how to build good questions. And that's, to me, I know what it means to get an early start on that process.
Thank you so much. And there are so many wonderful questions streaming in the chat. We are nearing the top of the hour though, so we won't be able to get to all of them. I know Chris is trying to respond to them in real time in the chat. So we're so sorry about not being able to attend to all the questions. But I know that Tom and Chris wanted to add some last words, parting words, if you may, for our attendees tonight. So I wonder if Chris, if you'd like to go first, and then we can pass to Tom.
Sure. So again, this is not going to be like a grand, like all summing up wisdom about research, except just do it, right? Like try it out. I remember I started doing research in high school. I think as my 4th year, I had an independent study project where essentially I didn't go to the classroom until noon. I was working on a project related to China's Cultural Revolution, and I found a book or two, and I was kind of just fumbling around on my own. And again, this is something where I just began with a topic, but was not really clear what the structure of the project would be, or the outcomes, or the methodology. I didn't know any brand name thinkers. So a lot of it was back to that original uncertainty, but some type of internal interest that I had the time and space to explore that turned out to be a really valuable experience. And it was something that I returned to later, and even return to now, decades later, as something that I recommend to other people, that sometimes if you are starting out on research, before you try to grasp for the meaning of your project, or even before you have figured out your question, to spend a little time just browsing search results, going beyond the first page of the Google search bar, and flipping through a book, going to the library and looking what's on the shelf next to that book that you've read and really liked, that may be in the same category, but may not be one you can find through keywords. So if you try to maintain this kind of open and flexible disposition, I think this is something that has, it's very much like research as a way of life, that it's not just how you kind of go about your academic career that can change, but kind of your way of interacting with other people, including realizing that there may be a lot of people who, you're in the same class or you're working on the same topic, but you may be motivated by very different problems. And, we hear a lot about the value of diversity in the academy, but I think diversity can mean also like diversity of thought and problems that may be cohabitating within one classroom or within one field. And so when you start to recognize people as being parts of these different problem collectives, or motivated by these different existential irritants, you start to realize what they're about. And I think this makes you a more empathetic person.
So I'll be extremely brief. One is that research is almost single-handedly the thing in high school, but certainly in college, that gives you a thread that connects these other units of time that that life is broken down into, which is courses. Courses, whether they're 10 weeks or 15 weeks, are not the natural division of intellectual work. That's purely a sort of bureaucratic convenience. Research, something that can sustain across time, that you carry with you across classes, across conversations with different instructors, that's how you find your home and your sense of belonging. Your problem is your home and your feeling of belonging. And many college students feel they go through college, they don't feel any sense of belonging. They don't feel any sense of community. That might be because of the actual makeup of the college itself, but in many cases it's because they never really did anything that extended beyond the 10-week fragmentary, broken up world of classes. They never actually dived into research. The ones I know who do research have this sense of continuity and belonging and community, and they end up loving the experience. Research is a way to build home.
Thank you, Tom. And Tom and Chris have hammered home that research is, it takes a community, just as, raising a kid takes a village. Andover as a high school is committed to sort of raising researchers at their most sort of fledgling stages and, trying to help them take flight. the books behind me, many of them were assigned to me by a lot of instructors who are on this call. Many of them are book recommendations from friends and peers who've also been crucial to my personal intellectual development. And so I just wanted to say that, we put on this event in an attempt to address some of your questions. We weren't able to be exhaustive, but that you're the reason we're here. And there's a quote from Tom and Chris's newest book, Where Research Begins. Some of you will be able to receive copies of it. So keep your eyes peeled in the next few days. That I think might be a good image to leave us with tonight. Tom was talking about finding our home and finding our problem. Oftentimes, once we find our home, it might be, quote, like getting away from the glare of the city lights. Suddenly, the sky was filled with stars. And I think that might be fitting, as we here in Andover are sort of blanketed in streetlights and the evening. But try to find your stars, try to find that home, and may you have a good rest of your night. Thank you so much.